hard challenges whose purpose is to bring you towards the end, right? And I'm like, I don't want to have a hard experience, and I don't want this to end. So like,
You're like, I'm just digging in my sandbox.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 392 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm decrepit and old.
I'm Sam, and I'm slightly less decrepit and old. But I'm on my way. I'm trying.
What?
So I'm
Yeah,
on my way.
you're moving toward it at normal speed.
Yeah.
So keep it up. You'll get there.
At breakneck pace.
No, that's too fast.
Oh, sorry,
That's
yeah,
too
right.
fast to age. This is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is December 2, 2022.
I love these ones.
Yeah, a lot of twos this time around. Before we go any further, we do have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. So I imagine that has never deterred a single person. Maybe we don't need to do it anymore.
Probably not, to be honest.
I think it's just kind of part of the intro.
It's just part of the show. Well, my thinking is, since we do link to the podcast from the main menu of many of our games, then, it's not like somebody's going to a podcast app and there's like a little explicit tag next to it. They're just like, what's this? And then we just start cursing away,
Yeah. And plus, because it's fine that kids play our games will hear profanity because it doesn't hurt anybody. But
Kids love profanity.
if the kids' parents find out,
Yeah, that's the real problem.
we need when they get mad about it because they just can't handle the idea of profanity happening around the vicinity of their child's ears.
And then we hear about it.
Yeah, but if it remains the child's fault because we told them what was going to happen, that's not on us anymore. Then that's fine. We don't have to hear about it.
Yeah, it's about blaming children. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what this is. Intro is all purpose.
That's the
blame where it
core
should be.
message here.
Yeah.
It's the children are at fault.
Yep.
And also, we'd like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your monthly donations to keep the podcast going. Those are probably not children because they don't have bank accounts. So, all right, now let's talk about some games. Okay.
Yeah, let's go.
So first off, I got a real quick update on the new WoW expansion Dragonflight, which is I started playing it. It is great.
That's excellent.
It is. I legit don't have any complaints about it. And that's probably the first time since the first WoW expansion that I have said that.
When was that? 2006.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where almost every single time, they've come out swinging and they're like, we have some big new thing that we're going to add to the game. And all the players are like, please don't. Because as soon as you look at, the new thing that they're going to add, the cracks show immediately. And you're just like, I can see how this is going to like really mess with the core game experience. It's just too much shit stacked on top of the game. And so this time around in Dragonflight, they just said, what if we don't do that and we just return to form and just focus on the core game, make that really, really good, and have none of those extra wild ass kinds of things that we would normally do. And you can see it, like they've had extra development time to put into just making this huge, beautiful, expansive world. There's all kinds of hilarious and fantastic quests. Some quests that have been making a lot of people cry.
That's how you know. That's how you know you got them. When those tears start flowing.
And I think the best description of it I've heard so far is some YouTuber, and he said, people have been asking for a long time for WoW 2, and I think this is that. Because everything else felt like it was trying to stack more stuff on top of WoW. And this just feels like, what if it was WoW, like it originally was conceived of, but just way more fun and fluid and better and more beautiful, So again, this is like, it's an MMO and I'm going to be playing it sort of constantly for years, right? And so I don't know if that's going to hold up. This might be one of those ages like milk kinds of statements. But so far in the first week, I'd say on our did it nail it or did it whiff, I'd say for the first time in a long time, they really just nailed it sort of across the board. So the only downside is all the new stuff is so great that this is a legacy problem. But like the rest of the game is still there, and every now and then you've got to go back into some of the older zones and some of the older places. and it feels like you've kind of just walked into a different sort of shittier game.
It's a ratcheting fidelity problem.
Yeah, and especially because like the big new kind of like cool thing that they updated is this new dragon riding system, where like the way that you get around in the new continent is you get a dragon at the beginning, and it has this really cool and fun sort of like flight mechanic where there's momentum to it, and you've got to kind of like manage, how it is that you're pitching the thing, and it like takes corners with like some turn radius and stuff. But in the old game, the way you flew around was you would just sort of like
go in a straight line.
You just go in a straight line, and you just instantaneously be moving at a fixed speed, and then you just instantaneously stop. So it's very much like a robot almost, right?
Yeah.
And so like my buddies and I had been flying our dragons around all throughout the week, and we're just like, it's weird because
hooping and hollering the whole time while you're
and it's weird because anytime somebody's like, hey, there's like this, rare elite enemy I just found over here in these mountains, like way the fuck, off in the middle of nowhere. And it's weirdly exciting because everybody's like, oh, I get to fly my dragon over there. So people are like, yeah, they're just like zipping around and stuff. So then we've been doing that all throughout the week. And then last night, for the first time, several of us went back to the old world, and we can't use our dragons there. They haven't updated the tech for some reason. Mm-hmm. And so we all got on our dumb, like old, static flying mounts, and we just were like going in a straight line. And there was like a silence on Discord for a moment, and we were all just like suddenly at the same time, we're like, this feels like shit. So that's kind of a problem, right? Like if you do something so well, but the game is so big that you can't actually sort of wholesale, replace the older stuff all at once, then, there's a contrast.
It is a problem. I think, we always talk about life.
The ratcheting fidelity problem.
Well, life in game dev is just about trying to choose better problems for yourself, right? You're never going to run out. So like, which problem do you want? You know what I mean? Do you want it to be the case that you made such a fun traversal mechanic finally after fucking 20 years that everyone's like, the rest of the game doesn't feel as good? Or do you want it to be the case that you just never do that, right? And it's weird that you have to ask that question, but I bet there was probably a big row internally when they started trying to do this thing, because it does make it weird to go back to old content. You know what I mean? Like,
and honestly, there's something that I've been pondering, because to me it seems like because this is an expansion, which means it happens at the end. Mm-hmm. So as a player, you level from 1 to 60, which depending on, how fast you go and how good you are at the game and that kind of thing.
It takes
that could be a 10 to 20 hour sort of journey. Mm-hmm. But that's through all the old stuff. And so all the new stuff, you don't get to experience all this cool shit until you've gone through everything else.
This is actually the main reason that I never even consider playing WoW, because I don't care about it as a historical artifact, right? Yep. So like, I don't want to play through all of the old stuff. And I also don't usually play games for that long before I'm just like, oh, I've had enough, And so as it currently stands, like I can't play WoW and get to the stuff that sounds fun to me, because I wouldn't have enough fun getting there. And I would definitely stop well before that.
Yeah. And this is it's a problem, because the new stuff is designed so well, in my opinion, that if they had, come up with a way to just drop a new player right there at the start of it, that player could learn the game and have a blast right away, right? The problem is that area is only it's like balanced around leveling you from level 60 to 70. And so, another player who starts there, they would just run out of quests. Like they wouldn't be able to level the whole way, because it's not meant for that. And so to me, it's like for existing players, or for people who, can get through the old world stuff, this new expansion just fucking nails it. If you're coming into it and you don't want, if you want to go straight to the great stuff, I'd say it whiffs in that department, because
onboarding is a little rough for a
because you do have to level.
Yeah, you're 20 hours of onboarding or whatever.
Well, honestly, like every old MMO has this like new player experience problem.
Well, it's actually any live service game, right? Any game that's maintained over long periods of time, because their main goal ends up being to prevent churn, right? So it's keeping existing players around. And so it has to be all about, well, given that these players have already experienced lots of stuff, how do we give them additional new experiences, right? So sort of definitionally, it's late game content, right? And you see this in any game, even things like Fortnite, right? Where like the core part of the game isn't really dependent on you playing, 20 hours to level up or whatever, right? But the game changes in these like subtle, small ways just constantly over time. And the community
tend to make things more complex.
Yeah. And the community is there the whole time, right? And so the community is simultaneously establishing like community cultural practices and behaviors and ways of interacting with the game. And so the population is co-evolving with the product, right? So the new player experience continues to become more and more intimidating for any live service game. And I think with WoW, what we're seeing is kind of late stage game as a service, right? Where the amount of content is so just fucking enormous, right? And it's all built like we talked about last week with if your system is a leveling system, if it's all based on growth, right? It runs out. And that's so WoW's whole model is like, okay, add a new chunk of growth, and that's what an expansion is, and then it runs out. Then you add a new expansion, right?
You kind of have to have a reset switch every couple of years.
But since the existing players like need to feel like they have more late game content, then you can't set the whole thing to zero, which means all of your new players coming in, right, are just further and further and further. But and I felt this with like any game that's been out for a while that's popular.
Oh yeah.
Where they add content, Rocket League, like literally, no matter how simple it is, right? As it stays out longer and longer, you get into basically the attach rate sort of problem where you're trying to figure out how to, I guess, basically by trying to maintain your existing player base, you necessarily make it harder for new players to come in, right? Mm-hmm. And I think like WoW, what we've seen is like what they talk about every time a new WoW expansion comes out is the fraction of players who came back, right? That's what they talk about.
Yeah, it's a saturated market, right? It's if you haven't played WoW yet, the chance of you starting to play it is very, very low.
But it's actually the chance goes down over time because it becomes more formidable to start it.
That's what I'm saying but there's a self-fulfilling problem there, which is, if I think in the history of WoW, there's been over 100 million people have made accounts and subscribed at some point, right? So it's like, all right, here's a pool of people who some of them are still playing, but others of them tried it, got a feel for it a little bit, and then decided it wasn't for them, at that time, or they their friends stopped playing or whatever it is. And so meanwhile, there's an indeterminate pool of players who were unconvinced at any point in time so far to pick it up. And to get those players, you'd have to do something so big and crazy, but also so different, right? From like what the game currently is doing that it's almost impossible to engineer towards that.
I think it's pretty safe to say that if you haven't picked it up after 20 years of it being around, going through all the cycles that it's gone through, that probably, unless you've not heard of MMOs before, like unless you've literally never heard of it, then it's probably just not an audience that the game can reach super effectively, right? Like you're not gonna have like your Call of Duty, bros getting involved in WoW for any particular reason, right? Unless like when you want to put shooters in it, it's like a different,
they're looking for something else.
Yeah, and that's okay. It's incredible that it's had that much reach over its whole lifespan, though. But
yeah. So anyway, on the nail whiff spectrum so far, I'd say for me, nailed it completely. We'll see. And then Sam, you want to talk about God of War?
Ragnarok. So I have a PS4. I never got a PS5. Haven't really tried, but just figured PS4 still plays basically every new one that comes out. So I'm like, okay. Anyway, that's interesting. So God of War Ragnarok came out, and this is the sequel to the I think it was 2018 was when the last one came out, which was mind blowing for me at that time because it's basically shot as one. It's basically done in one continuous shot, where you're following behind the back of the character. And even through these like cutscene moments, through these incredible boss fights, all this stuff, there's no transition ever. And they take it to the next level in Ragnarok. I'm not going to spoil much, but basically they just introduce more characters and stuff like that you actually get to play with. And so it's like, it feels like what they did with the first one is sort of like, I can't, like the amount of tech they had to develop to get that fucking thing to work, I just can't even imagine, right? And then at the end of that, you're like, okay, we could barely put a game probably together, with the last 5 months of time, now that we've made it possible to do what we wanted to do, like here's the last little bit. So the sequel then feels like they literally just were able to go,
they had all the tech now, right?
Yeah.
And the experience of like using the tech, because it's also its own really hard thing.
Yeah, it's like as far as it's just like more, but on all of the dimensions. And so it definitely nails it if you're into that kind of cinematic blockbuster style. It's basically, it feels like a 30-hour movie that you kind of mash buttons through on occasion. Like that's sort of the fun. It's really something else. I will say it does get a little stale for me every so often because they do this weird thing with pacing, which happens in a lot of open world games where, you're going through an area and this game is extremely story driven, right? Like it is story. And so you're kind of talking to characters as you're walking, you're moving towards some very particular objective that always has a bit of urgency to it. And I don't know who did the level design this time around, but they sprinkled just too many goddamn chests around the space. Okay. So it's like, you're trying to go somewhere and then they keep on, it's like, it's just weird that there's just chests. Like they're like, oh, here's a chest over here. And you're like, I don't have an interest, or it feels like the appropriate motivation to go.
Yeah, but there might be something good.
But there never is. It's just like some currency. And it's like, why is this here? Just bundle it up and put one of them in an interesting spot for me to find, as opposed to kind of like breaking up that flow. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
drip feeding boring content doesn't really.
Well, this actually reminds me of, we had so many conversations about what exploration is when we were working on Crashlands 2, because it's this word that we always use when we're talking about building open world games, or, I want a game that has lots of exploration. And like exploration, as a lot of, I think, game designers talk about it, is basically just, I hid a thing somewhere. Mm-hmm. And if you sort of wander around enough, you're going to come across it.
Yeah, you look literally everywhere.
Yeah, which to me is kind of like the least interesting mechanism of exploration possible. To me, exploration, like done well, is more about sort of like unspooling mysteries and secrets that the player can optionally go and pursue, and having those things sort of, like play out over time. But it's not just about geography. It's not just like there's a cave for you to explore, which in that case, explore just means go to, right?
Yes, yeah. It's learning to read the world, ideally, where you start picking up on cues and subtle hints about kind of what is where, and also like that you can miss stuff. I think that's the big thing with the way they place all these things. God of War, it's like, it's more on the compulsive side where you just see chests like all the time, but it's not that they're hidden in any way. It's not that there's like any question about, oh, did you miss that? It's like you always see them, and then it's just sort of a question of like, do I ignore that because I don't care about $12 coming out of it, or do I just
but then in the back of your mind, you're always thinking like, this is a video game. Chests have valuable things in them. One of these chests is going to have something worth.
Yeah, so now you just kind of have to open all of them.
So it's kind of this like contract, between you and the designers, where they're like, we went out of our way to make this secret pathway for you to figure out how to get up there and get this chest. So we're going to put something worthwhile in there, and then they don't, right? Yep. And so I think there's also a completionist aspect, right? Like seeing a thing and then leaving it untouched is just like mind-boggling for a lot of people. So
I think the Fallout games, like 3 in New Vegas in particular, kind of have they have this same problem, but they also have the good version of this at the same time, right? Because like in the Fallout games, as you explore the world, you can like open every locker you see. Right. And you can pick up everything. So there's like, you could sell everything, like all the junk, right? And so you have an incentive to like literally pick up everything and look in every nook and cranny and just pick up everything, right? And after a pretty short amount of time, it feels like something you have to do, and it's not very interesting, right? But at the same time, all of the locations that you visit where this stuff has usually an implicit story, but sometimes it's an explicit, part of a quest line of some sort. But there's always like some kind of a story. It's like you'll hack it. It's like, and you interact with a computer terminal by hacking it, and you get XP for doing that. So like there's a reason to do it, But then once you do, you're just like reading notes that were left behind from some weirdos, 200 years in the past or whatever, right? They give you like a glimpse into like some dumb office politics or into recent bandit encampments or, whatever, right? And so like there's some story there. And as you move around inside these spaces where like the dead bodies are laid out and how like the environment is set up is all telling a story so that while you're out there like doing the boring tedious thing of like picking up literally everything or looking at every single
and managing your inventory
manage your inventory, which I just hate. But as you're doing that stuff though, you're doing it in this really interesting space so that you exploring that space and doing that tedious stuff is always rewarded by the sense that like this isn't just random. This is like this is a place with junk in it. You know what I mean? So like the junk is there because there's junk in places. So that's why that's there. And so, but the space itself is actually interesting and worth exploring. Right. Yeah. So that when I'm playing those games, like I always go like, it's kind of a funny thing actually. Like in those games, I never go to a place because I'm like, ooh, that place might have stuff in it. Right.
No, you want to find out I
just want to see what's over there, you know? And then while I'm there, I then happen to find stuff and I just expect it to mostly be junk because that's most of what there is. Right. But every once in a while, you stumble into something like in the beginning of Fallout New Vegas, there's a hotel as you start moving south, like pretty early, and you go into it, right? And it's like it's at your level, so you can kind of like fight your way through, and it's fine. But right at the very beginning, there's a lock on a little safe that's like a max skill lock, right? There's no way at that point in the game you can get into that, right? And so that's so interesting, right? It's like because going through this whole like there's a whole story that unfolds as you're going through it, and like every interaction you have with this place is telling you part of the story. But then there's just this like this little thing at the very beginning that like just puts a little itch in your brain for the rest of the game, right? Because then, and I think to this day have never gone back and opened that chest because by the time I get to the end, I've forgotten about it again, you know. But then every time I replay again, I'm like, oh fuck, what is in this chest? You know, like what is in here?
Yeah, well, I think that's the difference between these moments of embedded, content or embedded rewards in the game world, and then just gameplay rewards. And I think honestly, like that was my only gripe. But so high level, of course, it nails it because it's just a fucking ridiculous situation.
Because it's God of War.
It's God of War, but like, but I would say that the fastest way to improve it, if I could, would be just to Thanos snap actually probably 90% of those additional chests and stuff. Just get rid of them.
I think the move is instead of having like a huge number of things like this that are like easy to spot from the main path and then also fairly easy to get to, but also fairly unrewarding. It's like instead have 5% as many, 10% as many, have them be more elaborate to get to and put something in there that's worth the trouble, you know?
Well, the thing is, they do have those. That's like, then
just like get rid of the rest of them.
Fucking purge these things out of here. They're ruining my pace. But yeah, it was a good time. It was a very good time.
Good.
I heard I've been trying to catch up on my feed reader from like all my RSS feeds. I'm trying to swap out that habit for some of the worst internet habits, you know?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And but I'm like 500 articles behind across all of my feeds, right? So it's been a while. So I'm kind of like flipping through it. So I'm kind of catching up with what's going on and what's been going on.
Oh yeah, what has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, across like the games and the tech sectors and stuff. Yeah. And I saw from a few weeks ago a story about there's an early access game that's basically 3D. I should have forgot the name of it. RimWorld, right? And to the point where in the description of the game, I think it was on Polygon. I think they were playing because it's in early access, and they had just released or about to release some big content patch or something. But they were to the point where they were basically talking about how it's like a shameless ripoff of RimWorld, but like as a pretty like 3D world. Right. But that you get kind of all the same experiences there. So I can't remember what this thing is called. But this is something that I think we should all.
I'm sure if I think about like 3D,
it would probably come up. But it's something we might want to check because I think we all had fun with OG RimWorld, and I'd be really curious to see what that plays like.
I still play it. I played it just a few weeks ago, actually.
Did you?
Yeah. I always get to the point where I'm starting to build the spaceship to actually like take off my colony. And then I never finish from there. I don't know why. It's just
because once you do,
Actually, it's interesting, right? Because I had the same experience in Subnautica, which is still one of my favorite games, right? But like every moment of interacting with Subnautica is so interesting. You know, speaking of like the world is just so interesting, and like yeah, sure, you're finding loot as you go, but like I don't really care about that actually, right? But I feel zero incentive to escape the planet. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, you kind of
because the whole point is supposed to be like, oh no, you're trapped on this planet. Oh no, you need to get away. You know, but I don't want to though because the planet is so interesting.
You're like, but have you seen this planet? It's so good.
Yeah,
why would I want to leave?
Yeah, which is kind of an interesting like incentive, or I guess like story incentive, like alignment problem actually, right? Of when you're doing survival games, if the end goal is to leave, then it's literally to stop having fun doing the thing that you're doing, right? Instead of having the end goal be some sort of
make a home
amount of exactly, making a home, like establishing yourself in this place.
Yeah, but I think the challenge there is, of course, that like once you have survived, once you've made your home, once you're comfortable, the game just is done now.
It is done,
right?
yeah.
Like,
but it's true, but like I don't know, but like I think that like as Sam experienced, like taking then that next step when the game is done, of being like, well, see ya, and like leaving, you know, like doesn't. Yeah. It's like two bad incentives on top of each other now, right? It's like you get to the end, there's nothing else to do except not just stop playing and like leave and like walk away from the game, but like literally permanently exit, you know, this adventure you were on.
Yeah. Well, there was a post in the Crashlands subreddit just a few days back, and the title of the post was just something like, I feel so empty. And it was a post where this person was just they had played Crashlands like top to bottom on mobile, just done every quest, everything that they could do. They finished the story, and this post was where they were just like, I want there to be more. Like I want to keep playing, but I don't have anything else to work toward, and I think I have to be done. But I don't know what to do with myself now because like I want to just keep being in this space, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
But I mean, I felt that with any game that I was really into that did end in some way, you know, and whether that was ending by literally ending or by
just running out.
Yeah. I think either way, the outcome is the same, where it's like, if it's and this is the same thing with like novels and stuff too, right? There's a handful of novels I've read where at the end of it, I was like, bring me back into the, and I was like kind of mad about it. You know, I was like, I'm really brought back into this space, right?
I was reading about I think it's a sociology term, and it's such a vague term that I wish there was an actual name for it, but it's the third place. Have you guys heard this?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like people always talk about how, you've got your home life and your work life, and like there's like a work-life balance that's very important, right? But in general, people also have a third place, which is not home and it's not work, but it's some other place.
It used to be like cafes and kind of
a bar or a club that you go, like, or church, or it's like some place where you go and you routinely go to have some kind of fulfillment in your life, and that's like a core, like third pillar of your life experience, And so I think something that is kind of interesting about a long-lasting game that maybe you could play for like 100 hours is it actually becomes your third place for some period of time, right? And I think this is also why people, binge watch things on Netflix, whatever. It's like your mind sort of like takes you to this other place, and you just want to be there. You just want to stay there, right? As long as you can. And sometimes often those third places run out of steam. Like maybe it's a church, and like you moved to a new city, and of course that church isn't there, right? And so you have to rebuild that, if maybe it's a video game that you've been playing, like League of Legends, right? And like your friends stopped playing, so your third place is gone, and it's not the same, and you got to go find something else, right? So I think, and like this is something we've been talking about this week of Crashlands 2, and kind of like making sure that we're really engineering it toward a solid vision of what the player experience is, and that I think it's a good goal to make a world, or to try to make a game that can be that, for some amount of time. Even if like, Sam, you were talking about Cult of the Lamb the other day and how like it's like a 12-hour game or something. But when people start playing it, they just play like straight through. Oh, it's so fun.
It's a great space to hang out and be.
And then like when it's like you know that your game has reached third place status when once people are finished with it, they feel like something is missing in their life, right? Because it is like they gotta find something else to fill that space,
Yeah. Well, there's kind of think about it in those terms too, right? Like thinking of the thing that you're making, whether it's a game or not a story of some other form, right? As something that's trying to create that third place, right? A sense of a place where it feels like, and like belonging isn't even quite the right word. It just feels like you're closely associated with it, right? Like you're just like really in tune with that story and the characters involved, whether they're real or not. But trying to create that place, if that's the goal, then there are some things, some like kinds of stories that are counter to that, right? And I think the one of like trying to leave is a really good example of like kind of unintentionally, like because original Crashlands actually then does that, right? Because like your goal is to, because you crash landed,
get off this planet,
right? But in the process of like doing that, because I'm thinking about like when I played Crashlands myself, I never actually thought about leaving the planet, right? And fortunately, the way that we designed all of your actual like story experiences in the moment are all about like, oh, like your packages are gone, so you gotta go get your packages, right? It's all things that are not leaving, right? Even though that is like the overarching kind of goal. So because that goal doesn't feel like your goal, even though it's what's driving the core story through, right? Then it doesn't actually conflict with that experience of creating that third place, right? But it would be very easy when you have that kind of a goal to do that. Or, with Crashlands 2, I'm not sure where the story is currently in terms of, and of course we won't talk about it here, but in terms of like what the overarching goal is, right? But the difference between having the overarching goal be, again, to like leave versus to solve some problem locally that doesn't have anything to do with you leaving or staying or whatever. It's just like about what the local problem is. Then if that's kind of the thing, then we can design the rest of like the stories and experiences around establishing yourself in this third place, right?
Building your roots.
Yeah. Instead of like building up your tech to get better at leaving.
Instead of just passing through.
Get better at staying.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but that's actually an interesting sort of encapsulation. Because actually I feel this way too about like any game that I'm really enjoying, like Terraria, like any of these that I just enjoy experiencing and like
just being
stuff.
in.
Yeah, just like in going through it, is that I'm completely disinterested in like final bosses, late game content. I don't care about any of that stuff because all that is like these like hard challenges whose purpose is to bring you towards the end, right? And I'm like, I don't want to have a hard experience, and I don't want this to end. So like,
you're like, I'm just digging in my
I'll just
sandbox.
I'll just going and doing other stuff.
Yeah, and this is something that I think it's, for whatever reason, even though this is like once you sort of talk about this concept with people, every person is like, oh yeah, I have that. Like I have a third place. Like for some people it's books, for some people it's games, for some people it's a specific game, or like these different community things. But
it's likely to be more diversified, right? Because just how society works, like home and work are these like two monolithic entities, right? But this like third place of this other things that occupy your space. Yeah, and depending on who you are and what you're into and what your social circles look like, the number and variety of those third places, right, is huge. Is huge, yeah. But like one of the interesting things about, so like I have so many old WoW friends from way back when, who I haven't spoken with in some cases 10 years, 15 years. So many of them are coming back to play Dragonflight, and several of them have used almost the exact same phrasing where they basically said, I feel like I'm coming home. Yep.
Right. And it's like, it's weird because that's like the closest framing we have for it, but it's like, it's not your home. It's you're like returning back to like this third place.
Well, I think it's the same idea.
That was so important to you way back then.
It's the same idea as family, right? Which is like family is not, when you like restrict the definition of family to the people who you are genetically very proximal to, right? Yeah. Instead of the people with whom you've shared certain kinds of experiences and have a collection of social expectations, right, about what those dynamics look like, and that's the part that's constrained in some way, right? That the kinds of like what it means then to like go do stuff with your family, right, and have like a family event. What that actually means for somebody completely depends on how tightly you've defined that, right? Because it can then be a negative thing depending on how it's constrained, or it can be an only ever positive thing depending on how it's constrained, right? Yeah. And I think this idea of like home is identical to that, and then this idea of like the third place as like part
home may not be where you live.
Yeah, exactly. It's part. It is part of
And
it.
you can have many. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
Well, and all these things overlap too, right? Because like because you'll have friendships in these third places, right? And whether or not those overlap with the other kind of pillars of like your work or your non-third place home life, whatever, like family life and all these things, right? These all kind of because home is a place where like you're comfortable and where like some subset of your people are, right? And where you have like an established comfort and history.
Yeah. I almost say it's where you can exist without feeling like you have to, prove yourself or earn that right.
Yeah, it's a place you have a right to be.
Where you belong. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, people call like people have like their home bar, right? It's like
Well, it's like Cheers. That was
exactly. It's like the place they stop by after work most days.
Where everybody knows you and you know the space. That's sort of the piece.
Right? Yeah, everybody they sleep in their apartments, but they live at the bar. Right. That's their home.
Yeah, and games, with where you play other people can be that, like World of Warcraft, but also like a good novel or TV series can do that too, right? Because you can still experience that parasocial, and comfort and environment, in that way too. So like the consequences of both, like when for some reason it ends, is a hollowness.
You become lost for a while while you're trying to find a new place to belong.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about Crashlands 2. Now, Sam, do you want to kick this up? What we've been doing this week, or what's happened?
Just what's happened is I think it's interesting, kind of getting into it along these lines, talking about these other large game experiences, because what has happened is relatively simple on the face of it, which is that over the Thanksgiving break, both Seth and I were, I guess you get those longer periods of time where you're just thinking about stuff, thinking about the structure of things, and get a bit of distance from the work itself on the day-to-day. And both of us were at the same place, which is that we were having a hard time. I've been trying to build the next kind of round of content for the game. And, we talk about in dev and design how hard it is to go from 0 to 1, which is the first problem. And by that, I mean a non-experience or a shitty experience to an experience that more closely is, what you think the vision of the game is. And then the next trouble, which comes from going from 1 to 2, which is to say, how do you take that and scale it? Including, we talk about these growth models. How do you make a thing that kind of interacts with that baseline core experience?
I would say 1 to 2 is not the scaling problem.
It's 1 to many.
Yeah, because 1 to getting something where it's like, all right, we've made like a creature for the game. Now let's make a second creature, right? Mm-hmm. That's more like a
incremental.
Yeah, it's like a testing ground where you're kind of like, you discover some cracks in your process, but you're still just doing one more thing, you know? And so it's a little bit of a refinement stage, but yeah, it's not really until you get from the 2 to N. Yeah, that's like the final huge jump that is very hard to make.
Yeah, and so we've been positionally, we've been building out a bunch of the remaining systems for the game in the process of kind of working toward our next milestone internally, which is related to having a boss fight. Right? Being able to do that requires all the rest of the systems of the game to be actually online, more or less, right? Because you need player growth to be able to get to a point where they can defeat a boss. You need stuff then for them to, equip cool things out in the world to do more things than they currently do.
You need a fully fleshed out zone that has everything in it.
Yeah.
That can lead to this experience.
Yeah. It's so
really it's saying like, oh, we're going to have our first boss fight. It's us basically saying we're going to finish the whole first zone.
Yeah. Well, it's saying, what does it look like? What does it look like to go to N? Is actually basically what it is, right?
Yeah.
And in the process of that, while the systems dev has been going very swimmingly, like very quickly, in the back of my mind, I have been trying to figure out how to think about the content part of it. So how do you think about all those extra pieces that come into the game? And the reality with something like Crashlands is that everything talks to everything, and so it's very challenging to know what to make when, because in the case of this game, weapons aren't just like a random sword dropped by an enemy. It's a very particular sword made of particular components that you can see in the sword, which means that if you move it down the tech tree somewhere, it doesn't make any sense anymore because it doesn't have those parts. Yeah. And so it's a sort of it's an interesting wrinkle we've gotten ourselves into. I mean, we knew this, of course, because we did the first time too. But it basically makes it so that as the game has become more, as our systems have gotten better for making this game that actually has a really good open feel to it and an open experience, a lot of breadth, that gets actually harder to answer the question of what is something made of at certain junctures, right? And this really led to both Seth and I feeling this sense of like not being able to quite see what was happening. And by that, I mean, like we already have like 100 things in there, you know, in the game. And just knowing how they relate to each other has been increasingly challenging as there's gotten to be more of them. And then you want to talk about adding the next round of more. And it's like, I can't see far enough.
Yeah, there's a core reason why it's so hard, which is that in the original game, we had I'd call it like a vertical progression system where you would like be in a certain area of the world, and there's like one or two resources that you can harvest, and there's a creature that is relevant for that level. And all the stuff that you're building is built around just that, right? And when it comes time to sort of grow in power, there's always one next thing that you do, which is you build the next workstation.
Yep.
And you build the next tool, right? And then from there, the next workstation starts with armor, weapons, all the stuff that you need to start to power up, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like, it's almost like Crashlands, the original Crashlands was a series of encapsulated experiences that would then have like a bottleneck that you always had to pass through, which was the next workstation to get to the next tier. And in Crashlands 2, we do have workstations. We do have workstations that open things up, and we do have tools that allow you to better harvest things, stuff like that. But it's not set up in that way where it's just like, here's the next set of things. Instead, it's fully branching where, you know, the player can decide what sort of like things to pursue and go after whenever it's relevant to them. And as a result, from a design perspective, as more and more things get added, the branching nature of the progression has become just incredibly unwieldy for us to think about without some kind of a visual map.
Yeah, that's basically where we ended up, which is that over the break, then Seth made this progression map, which we've tried a bunch of different ways of mapping the content in Crashlands 2. And again, the content we have so far is the kind of that initial salvo, not just the 0 to 1, but probably the 1 to 2 sort of thing. And the progression map basically becomes this way for us to actually see how a player could flow through that content, given that it basically ends up being a bajillion different parallel or branching tracks, but they can start at certain times, they can end at certain times. Each one leads to other things, and so figuring out how to map that was kind of the challenge that we've had since we frankly got the first round of content in. We've been trying to figure out a really good way to do this. And thankfully over the break, then Seth was tooling around some more, and I think kind of cracked it in terms of delivering something that allows us to see not just the content of the game in terms of like the weapons, the stations, but also how those intersect then with quests, which is the other fucking part, which is like, how do you then in a progression track know if so-and-so needs to give you this component from a quest before you could even build a station or whatever else? And to being able to see this whole flow of how a player can walk through and branch through all of this different content, the different parallel tracks they could take, positions they could be in at points in time, et cetera, has been this kind of missing piece for us that I think that the fact that it was missing has made it so we've been focusing more so on rounding out the systems, because those are clear as far as like, we can't do X or Y yet, and we know we want to do X and Y, so let's just focus on the design and the tech of those, but without necessarily allowing us then to actually build a specific thing that utilizes that system. Like that's kind of where we've been for the last little bit, because it's been unclear.
Yeah, or even like the idea of saying, okay, we know that there's going to be a creature that's like a level 4 creature, and it's going to be in this area of the world, right? Mm-hmm. To just stub that in and come up with some, generic placeholder components for it to drop, like where we have a general idea that like, all right, this, maybe this creature is going to be all about, fire, and it's going to breathe fire or something like that. So we can just call it like fire creature, right? Yep. and just put that in the world. We haven't been able to do that kind of a thing because without this kind of visual map, that would have just added more cognitive load. It would have added more mental overhead for us to know what it is that this thing is supposed to do. How is it supposed to fit into the flow of the game, right? And so this makes it so that we can go ahead and do a much more thorough job of mapping out all these different experiences the player is going to have. And then keep track of which aspects of these paths are completed, which ones are, still in draft mode, or which ones are just kind of like gray boxed, right? And so, it's provided so much clarity and such a relief. Mm-hmm. But I'd say the reason that it's taken us so long to do this, because to me this is like the rule number one of DevOps, make the work visible, right? And we've known that this is a problem where it's been pretty difficult for any one of us, because our work is more distributed now too, because our tools have improved where a lot more people can add content to the game. But with this much interdependency of game systems, if you're trying to add content, but you don't have a full mental model of how the other 200 things fit together that you didn't add to the game, right? Then how are you going to do it, right? And so we've talked a bunch of times about just that this is a hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I had looked into all kinds of different ways to map out information. So like there's some really interesting stuff like Markdown language there's a thing called Mermaid Markdown, mm-hmm. which is like an extended version of Markdown, where you can basically make these sort of self-organizing flowcharts and diagrams just out of text, and then it converts them into a visual. And so earlier in Crashlands 2 development, I was experimenting with that kind of a thing. And it did work when we had
that first tier content.
It worked when we had like 20 or 30 things. Mm-hmm. But now that we have hundreds of things, which is like quests and characters and these sort of like research things and crafting and stations and recipes and, now that we have all that stuff, the mermaid diagram just basically turns into a ball of spaghetti.
Yeah, you can't read it.
Because if any one thing can have, 4 or 5 prior dependencies, and it can lead to 4 or 5 other things as well, right? That if you multiply that out over a couple hundred nodes, then all you see is lines. Mm-hmm. All you see is dependency lines, right? So I started looking into all kinds of other ways to graph out these like hyper dependent, kinds of relationships, and nothing seemed to actually. There are lots of things that look visually interesting, like these kind of node maps where you see like these like nodes of different sizes spread out, and they have like all these curvy lines kind of connecting them. But if you're thinking about this from a decision making perspective, still, how are you going to use that mm-hmm. to make decisions about?
Well, this is the thing with all visualizations of information, right? And anybody out there who hasn't, I don't know if we've ever talked about this in podcasts before, but this used to be a passion of mine from my grad school days. But there's a guy named Edward Tufte, which I think is Tufte, who has a few books about very, very nice visual books. So you'd want them in physical.
Visual display of quantitative information.
Yeah, there's that one and a few similarly named ones. Like there's 3 that are good, and there's like a weird PowerPoint one that's very outdated.
Yeah, he's really into making beautiful visuals, not into beautiful titles of books though.
Yep. Yeah, but it's very cool because basically he goes through and he gives examples of like mostly of good visual displays of information, right? But sometimes some worse ones as kind of counterexamples. Yeah. But there's kind of rules of thumb that get pulled out of there. But the core thing is he just found these really interesting examples and kind of put them together. And the core idea there is that the person who built that way of viewing the information took the intersection of what is the data, and then what do I want the person who's looking at it to be able to do with it, to be able to conclude from looking at it or whatever, right? And instead of being like, okay, well, here's the kind of charts that exist, I'll just go off the shelf, grab my bar chart and stick the bar chart on there, right? Instead of doing that, they said, okay, well, what I'm trying to make people understand is like this very specific concept, because all data is specific, right? So let me like start with this one idea, but then kind of customize every way that it comes together so that when you're looking at it, you just like instantly can like get the effect that I'm trying to display, right? And I think this is the same thing where if you're talking about like graphs, like the math idea of a graph, which is just a bunch of nodes and lines sticking together, right? Mm-hmm. That's what most things in the world are actually like. That's like the best way to actually describe most things.
Just a blob of relationships.
Connections. And like these kinds of graph views can be really useful for certain kinds of questions, like which things are like have the most, like which one of these are a hub, like for a social network, right? Like who are the hubs in this thing? And you can kind of like zoom out and see this really cool thing where there's like this giant bubbles with some like little lines flying off into the distance to these other giant bubbles, right? And if you're trying to then display that idea, like that works really well. Or if you're trying to construct a thing that you're going to query and ask questions like, how does this specific thing connect to that specific thing, right? So you can see that subset, also really useful. But if you're trying to be able to see everything and do things at the same time, it's not.
Seeing everything
you
is
need a
useless.
custom mechanism.
I will say a very good example of that first description you had of like nodes that are connected to a billion nodes. If you haven't seen one of these or kind of are curious what we're talking about on that kind of graph side, there's this, I think it's a subreddit visualizer thing that someone made where you can look at how all of the different subreddit communities overlap with each other in terms of their user bases. Oh. Which, if you're making a video game, it's actually a really good pro tip for some market research stuff for video games. You part of what you do when you're kind of initially setting up a design is finding what other games are similar. And if you're saying like no one's ever made a game like this before, then you're wrong. And humble yourself for a second and find them. But once you find them, you can actually look at the subreddits for those games and see what other things they're connected to, which can also help a little bit in terms of either describing sort of overlap in shared interests that you can push into a little bit more on a particular game's design, or even visual style and stuff like that. But that's a really good example of that kind of graph node-based thing. But if you had to ask the question of like, okay, but where does the next one go? In that context, it doesn't really give you a good answer.
It's good for statistical understanding of populations of things, right?
Yeah,
but it's
relationships
not good
between
for explicit design of like what you're
Yeah.
like if you're in a context where you're creating those nodes and those edges, those lines between them. Being able to see them all doesn't actually help you from a design sense. I mean, you can use it to get like hints about like, oh, this thing is like really connected, right? Maybe we should make things less dependent on this one thing. Like there's still stuff you can pull out of it from this like big picture view, but when you're down to the details, that's where like those kinds of things just don't work anymore.
Yeah, and that was kind of the mental shift that actually finally clicked of saying, oh, here's how we need to look at this. Like here's how we need to lay this out was. Up until this point, I had just been focusing on displaying how things are connected. Right. It's drawing the connection lines of like this leads to that, this leads to that, right? But
the question is who cares they're connected? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, what are you trying to do? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to answer a question about if I want to add like a new creature or a new set of armor or a new quest, and I want that armor to be about, I want it to be like roughly this far into the game, and I want it to be all about lightning damage or something like that. What should it be made of? What kinds of creatures am I going to be fighting at that time? What characters will I have interacted with at that time, right? And so it's less about how things are connected, and it's just more about sort of like what kinds of things will the player have experienced up to that point, and what kinds of things will be around them. Right. And so the progression map, so I updated it into essentially it's a sequenced tier list where it's just like, okay, this is a tier 3 item, which means 2 things have led up to it.
Yeah. It doesn't mean it's like level 2.
Exactly. It means that there are 2 obvious hard dependencies prior to it that the player has to go through to get to it. Right. So that right there allowed us to sort of sequence all the things in the game, quests, characters, components, creatures, whatever, into these tiers where we can then see where there are bottlenecks. We can see, roughly like around the time that the player has access to thing A, they also could have access to thing B. So we could make those things connected to each other, in some way. Or, oh yeah, like this at this point in the game, there's lots of these components that are being dropped by these creatures, but they're not really being used for anything. They're just kind of like there, right? So let's use those, right? And so having this thing laid out like this, but then with the extra feature that you can click into any of these nodes to reveal its connections. So you can sort of like see the initial layout of how things are sort of sequenced in the game.
Yeah.
But then interrogate it further to find the connections. That was actually the
And actually,
the trick.
As you describe this, I'm also thinking about how one of the things that's always been, as we've talked about balancing things and like how to distribute stuff and figure out what's going on. One thing that's always added this like wrinkle to it as an open world game is that it's not just what the content is and how it relates to each other that defines what the player experiences. It's also where things are, right? Because you could have a tier 2 item that only has one other dependency, but it's like on a part of the map you probably won't reach for 10 hours, right? So that's still tier 1 content, right? But the cool thing about this way of displaying things is that you can then introduce, because you can basically introduce like a location concept into the same thing, right? We can basically say like, because now if a resource is dependent on a location, and even if the dependency is just like, you just sort of like roughly describe like, here's the center location, here's like the next, you just kind of describe some locations because you have to walk through one to get to the next one. So you could create a dependency chain of like locations on the map. And then if you can map the resources onto that, now all of a sudden the whole system can reshuffle itself.
Exactly.
To adjust for now.
Yeah, and this is also
dependencies, but also like where you find them out in the world.
Yeah. And kind of the key to a lot of this stuff was this idea of being able to infer how things are connected based on, their data, but then also being able to add manual connections.
Yes.
Where like an interesting example is that in the original Crashlands, we did a lot of hard gates where like if you have a saw, but that saw is too weak, then we literally just wouldn't let you use it on a higher a higher level plant, right? And so that's just a hard gate. And so we know for sure that you don't have access to the stuff in that plant, right? But in Crashlands 2, if you have a saw, or I guess in our case, it's more of a machete kind of a thing, but if you have your machete and then you come across a higher level plant, you can harvest it. It's just less efficient and it's going to take you longer. And so it's not a hard dependency. It's not a hard gate. But even stranger is that there's ecology. There are creatures that are also eating this plant and interacting with it, and they're leaving behind debris. And so technically you can collect the resources from this plant without ever getting the tool to harvest the plant.
Or ever fighting a creature, maybe, because like,
yeah,
maybe the plant explodes and kills the creature, and you get its parts.
Yeah, you could technically get, at least so far, you can get all the creature parts in the game without ever fighting any creatures. Now, it's not going to be your most efficient way to do it, because you've got to kind of set up scenarios to get them to fight each other or lead them into, death traps, basically. But you could do that. And so from a data perspective, there's nothing in the data that says like you need thing A to get thing B, because they're fairly loose in that way because of all these.
And we're also trying to avoid that because we want it to feel like you get to choose and like, and that you could just like start wandering and not really engage with the content that you're supposed to be engaging with at all, right? And still like have stuff to do and be able to interact with stuff, even if at some point like it becomes clear you really should get back onto some rough track, But it's trying to let you try to do stuff and just have that be fine, right?
Yeah, because you should be able to feel clever by like jumping ahead and getting some extra materials that you otherwise would have had a hard time getting, right? But that does mean that it's very hard for us to make a dependency map if there actually is no hard dependency, right? And so we've added in this concept of just being able to create manual dependencies where we can, for the sake of our own visualization and clarity, we can just declare, I want to say that like you need this machete to chop down this tree or to get the components from this tree.
Yeah, because even if it's the case, you could get them otherwise. But from our perspective, that's when you would be getting it at an efficient rate and kind of how we're intending to, right? Yep. And so it doesn't really matter that you can get it in other ways. It's a soft progression prior.
Yeah, so the same thing like with these locations where it's like, okay, let's say, there's a quest that, does something to like really open up access to this location. And you could actually get there through some other means, but it'll be like way harder and you won't be ready and blah, blah, blah. Right. Then that's a really hard thing to kind of detect automatically just by combing through the data. But yeah, we could just make a manual connection there. We'd say, all right, this location is dependent on this quest, right? And then boom, that location shifts forward on the map. And then we can say like, oh yeah, these resources spawn in this location. So then those resources shift forward in tiers.
And then does it mean you can't put like, because it's all about like the overarching. And this is the thing we've always struggled with, right? Because it's like in a lot of games, so take like Valheim, right? Where open world crafting, same core underlying principle, right? You can go anywhere. And the way that they do it though is that it is very much more like Crashlands 1 style, tiered content. But nothing is stopping you from going from a lot, because like, if you don't have a boat, what you need, certain resources to make, you're not going to go across the ocean to a new biome that's not available to you, right? But you can actually end up on a random map that has all the biomes right on it. So you don't even need a boat at all, actually, right? So that means that because like the biomes are just next to each other, it's like, well, here's a mountain you can start trying to climb up. Here's like a desert you could walk into, right? It doesn't make sense to put like an artificial boundary there, right? So there isn't one. You can just go out and do that stuff, right? It's just that as you move into the part where they want you to start climbing the mountain, because that's where the iron ore is, right? That's also when you're able to put ingredients together to make potions that protect you against the cold, right? That's also when you get to the tier of equipment where you can put on like a heavy coat that also, so basically now there's a cold debuff concept that they added in, so that in that space you just get cold. And so, you can do it, but there's like a natural sort of soft gate. And like you could just like down potions and just like fight your way through the like most ridiculous slog in the universe just to like get a little bit of iron ore very early, right?
Do it,
or like get a few creature parts that you're not technically supposed to have, and potentially then kind of like jump really far ahead across some things that were intended for you to kind of like work your way more slowly through. But it would have been so like hard and interesting to do that. And the end outcome is that because it's not how we designed it, or how they designed it, right? That you don't just have the full armor set now, right? You don't. It's still nothing like the intentional experience.
If you're not quite ready to collect the stuff efficiently, then you're probably also not ready to actually utilize it effectively. So.
Yeah. And so this is the kind of cool stuff of how you can like create these soft gates, but you need these kinds of displays of where there's some combination of like automatic hard gate that explains the dependency relationship between things, right? And also the design intended more soft, like not really built into the data exactly, like locations, the fact that you'll freeze to death, like this kind of stuff, right? Where you can put those in place where it's like, okay, technically that's a soft boundary. The player could work through it, right?
Yeah.
But it's okay because we don't care. It's fine, right? If they get out of the lane a bit.
It's not like there's a thing that happens at Valheim where like you build a boat and then a pop-up is like, congratulations, you've unlocked iron, right?
Yeah.
It's effectively, that is kind of what happens, right? But
it's all soft.
There's nothing in the game's data or code that would be a declaration that is what the gate is. That's what the unlock is, right? So being able to just say from a design perspective in a progression tree or something like, okay, boats lead to mountains, which leads to iron, but to get up the mountains, you need some way to get through the cold. So iron is dependent on cold resistance and boats, right? And so like being able to follow these trails.
Yeah, even if it's not strictly true, right? It's true enough.
It's true enough to be useful.
It's true enough by like the golden path. Because if you think of this from so the idea of a golden path through design is like, it's like basically the path that you design for somebody, right? So like if it's a web UI or whatever, it's like, okay, a user clicks the side button and they type in their thing, right? But in real life, of course, when a person actually interacts with that, they're going to scroll up and down, like go check an about page. Like they're actually going to do other stuff, right? And I think in a game design, you're dealing with the same thing, which is there's the golden path. There's the experience that you're trying to create. And then the question is, how do we allow for deviations off of that path without that like somehow being so fundamentally bad and like counter to the golden path's design that we then have to force that to not happen, right?
Yeah. So it's been a week. I mean, we built this tool as soon as we could see everything laid out. We had several dozen, oh my God, kinds of realizations and moments about certain things that had always felt off, but we couldn't quite place why, and got those reshuffled, and we've moved tons of things around. We got how many new items stubbed in already? Like,
yeah, it's like 20 or 30.
20 or 30
Yeah.
in just a couple of days. And so it's felt like, we've built all these new tools with the Game Changer that's allowed us to develop a very a large set of complex data.
Mhm.
But just because you have the technical capability to do that doesn't mean that you have the tools to design it and to see it and to collaborate on it. And so that's kind of the phase that we're shifting into a little bit is shoring that up so that we can rapidly take advantage of all of this tech that we've been working on. So it's been a wild time. I'm sure there'll be even more wild stuff over the next week. But that is all the time we have for this episode. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.